Nuruhuin, god of the black moon, is again an anomaly among the seven. Earliest records of her influence postdates all other scriptures by over a millennium. Official word from the Holy Fortian Church is that man was initially unable to recognize Nuruhuin. Her moon can only be seen as a small blotch of darkness in the night sky. Early civilizations may have viewed her eclipse before other moons as a pupil in other deities' eyes, crediting the other gods for events caused by her. There is some credence to the idea that Nuruhuin did not exist until 400 years prior to the fall of Old Fortia. This, of course, conflicts with belief that our gods are eternal, and therefore couldn't have manifest in a specific moment. But along with scripture, it is compelling that all artistic portrayals of the gods only depict the 6 other deities until this era. There are even some records in the ruins of Drome that suggest Nuruhuin appeared in the form of 3 dragons, specifically to see the city sacrificed. Brother Clune, heretic and traitor to the Holy Fortian Church. Part 1. Salty. Most men know never to use an expired potion. The changes are obvious. A blue bottle turns black. Rather than fizzing, the fluid churns and folds. Sweet fragrances turn sour. Upon removing the cap, a skull-shaped vapor emanates instead of the expected cloud of hearts. In the case of Dagger Leafstone, such warnings had been abundant. Even as Horace listened to the man recount his woes, he could point out no less than 7 details indicating Dagger should have stopped himself. While he tried to cut the man's tale short, there was no slowing the fool. Dagger would speak his piece. He would be heard. Idiot that he was. Standing in Horace's shop, Dagger brandished the empty bottle, illustrating his tale with a torrent of wild gestures. He explained his tragedy to the man who'd sold him the potion several years ago. Horace sighed, leaning into his counter. He'd grown bored of Dagger's ranting from the moment it began. The day had been so peaceful. Business was slow given the season. For several hours, the only thing to open Horace's door had been a breeze. He'd thought to close early, to head home and maybe spend time with his kids. It was just before he'd committed himself to that plan when Dagger barreled in, the stink of ale on his breath. Now it was near closing time. Horace started to feel as though he'd be locking his door late tonight. Multiple times, he considered throwing Dagger outside. He'd pondered the idea so long that it flourished into a daydream of tossing him, not just out the door, but into a pit of spikes over and over. The idea soothed him. Dagger's body flailing down into darkness, screaming until some jagged metal shaft impaled him. As Dagger's tale droned on, the pit in Horace's imagination grew deeper. Its spikes sprouted barbs. The places Dagger became impaled grew all the more colorful. Sadly, in a world where customers were taught to believe in and assert their authority over retailers, Horace couldn't just toss his worst patrons out the door. Without any actual torture pits on hand, he'd never hear the end of it. Dagger would bang on his windows. He'd be back in the morning. He might even return with a small mob of drinking buddies to assure his refund. No, Horace thought. Such is the curse of commerce. Best let him purge his grievances now, then hope to settle the matter in a more sensible fashion. Your potion turned her into an abomination, Dagger said again, his 10th time doing so. With every repetition, he emphasized the potion had been Horace's. Your potion. The potion from your shop. The potion you sold me. And now? Now? Look at the debacle on my hands. I barely escape with my life. What am I supposed to do? I've no home to return to. My wife won't awaken. My daughter's gobbled whole. Half the village was set aflame during my escape. Even if I remained whole, I could never show my face there again. Not after the horrors your potion left behind. So what you're saying is you're in need of an escape fund, some starting over money to replant your life elsewhere. Horace let the conversation's tiresome toll show in his tone. What I'm saying is you sold me some goblin goop bottled as a love potion. I require... No, demand. Yes, demand a full refund. In fact, I believe further compensation is in order given the severity of my circumstances. Horace sighed. He made note of how Degger was a slight man, spindly in places he ought to have meat. In another life, Horace would have settled the matter by concaving his skull, but there was, unfortunately, his reputation to consider. Horace the pirate was long dead. Horace the drunk. Horace the monster. Once upon a time, he had more names than he could remember. He'd been a man of so many infamous tales, he hadn't even heard them all. But that was another life. For near 30 years now, he enjoyed his one single name. He was Horace the shopkeep, trader of goods common and rare. Most who knew him as otherwise had long since died out, many of them lost to calamities of their own making. Many weren't entirely unlike Degger here. There was the part of him that thought, sure, killing Degger would be a gift to the world. But Horace enjoyed his life here in Sleeping Bear. Granted, the town's lack of a spiked pit was currently inconvenient, otherwise he'd settled in a good place. He liked his shop. His wife and children made him glad to be alive most days. Tempting as it was to crush Degger's head in one hand, chop up his body and scatter the chunks in several nearby pig farms, Horace refrained. He had a good life. For that, he kept his violent tendencies locked away with only occasional fantasies of spike pits escaping. Instead of butchering Degger, he calmly reiterated the situation. So, as I'm clear, he said, I recall selling you that love potion all those years ago under less murky circumstances. All? Only a few years ago. I feared my wife would leave me, Degger said. Horace held up one hand to silence his customer. He'd waited patiently for Degger to finish his ranting. Now he'd have his turn. She didn't, though. At the last minute, you questioned whether or not you truly deserved her heart, and rather than pour the potion out, you kept it secret whilst debating its necessity. As it happens, your wife stayed without the brew. It shouldn't matter how I used it, Degger said. The fact is, I bought it from you, it failed, and now my life is in ruins. Please, Horace said, holding up his hand again, affirming the need for silence. So, in whatever knothole or hidden cubby you stashed it in, the love potion sat. Over time, it lost its shimmer. It turned from red to purple and eventually black. All the while, your wife stopped being a bride and turned into a mother, a housekeeper, maybe a nag, I'm assuming, as she lost your favor. Moot as the point is now, I wonder how she stayed with you, loving you, despite your useless nature. She accepted your, well, let's call them imperfections. All the while you loved an idea of her, the perfect her. When she proved to not be the goddess in your heart but a woman, a human woman, you perceived her as no longer wanting you. I'm giving you more credit than you deserve, of course. She may have been perfectly content, but childbirth left her sagging in places while plumping in others. Hence the potion. Hence its eventual use on some barmaid. Zelen, Degger said. Horace motioned for silence again. This time, though, instead of merely holding up his hand, he reached out and grabbed Degger by the collar. With a quick twist to the side, Degger's head slammed into the counter. He fell back, sprawled onto the floor. He looked offended, as though he might have some objection to being roughed up, but Horace continued. Of course, Zelen, how you honor her. It does untold wonders to repeat the name of the girl you poisoned. I didn't poison her. She isn't dead. Well, praise be to the moons. Young Miss Zelen lives, for she was not poisoned, merely tricked or forced at knife point to imbibe some rot that caused her to bring ruin upon half your village. What exactly would you say your potion turned her into? I don't know. A giant thing. An abomination. Abomination. The young lady you pined for. Well, if that's all, then thank the gods it wasn't poison. The two men stared down one another, only one of them right to do so. The other, Degger, lost his stamina for scowling as he realized this fight wasn't one he could win. His lip began to tremble. He had no card to play. Get out, Horace said. You'll get nothing from me, so get out. Please. Degger shriveled like the cold prick he was. Please, if that thing finds me, I'd love to help you, sir, Horace said. But I'm afraid it's closing time. My wife, whom I love with all my heart, awaits me at home. Degger lifted a finger in objection, desperation on his face as he opened his mouth. A drink, then. If you won't repay me what's owed, then at least send me to the Black with a drink. There was a trick to throwing a person. Horace was certain of it. There had to be some method by which he could support an adult man with minimum strain to himself, all while allowing for easy control of the flailing individual, even when casting him out to the mud. As it happened, despite Horace's certainty of the skill existing, he had mastered no such technique. Strength wasn't the issue, especially over the likes of Degger. Leverage, perhaps. Maybe it was as simple as his age and a lack of finesse. The effort of throwing Degger outside became a clumsy several minutes of grasps and fumbles. Degger both begged for support and repeatedly slipped out of reach. Once Horace finally had a hold of him, the spindly bastard kicked over a shelf of exotic furs from the southern continent. A barrel of locally made arrows busted in on one side. Racks of tools spilled everywhere. Horace was only able to stop the struggle because he'd managed to wrap an arm around Degger's neck and squeezed half the life out of him. He didn't kill the man, although when all was said and done, his feelings on the matter were mixed. While there was some delight in finally living his dream of throwing Degger to the street, and in watching the fool fight to breathe on the ground, the damage caused didn't quite cover his victory. With the door safely locked, Horace faced the wreckage of his shop and uttered a handful of vulgarities. The majority of the store was fine. Horace reminded himself of that before giving in to his impulse to step outside to beat whatever air Degger had left in him. The store was his livelihood. It was his world. At home right now, his children would be matching each other in cards as Ingrida prepared supper for the guests at her inn. His parents might still be awake, although they gave themselves to sleep earlier and earlier in recent days. The mess was an inconvenience, a trivial disaster, perhaps even a lesson for having bartered with that wizard some years ago. Horace's shop began as a trading post back when his parents ran the inn. He'd returned to Sleeping Bear with Ingrida, the pair secretly avoiding arrest in dwarven lands. Together, they'd been given a second chance at life. The plot of land originally belonged to his father, but was gifted to Horace several months after his return. Do with it as you will, his father said. Their town was growing, but still considered backcountry in those days. A few buildings set just far enough from the Glau River to not attract attention from the local eel troll population. Trappers and hunters were regular guests. Few people stayed long. Horace thought to build himself a cottage away from the inn's traffic. Then it occurred to him that goods frequently traded among travelers. A shop to act as a hub for such business made sense to him. With several years of his opening, people seldom bargained with each other as much as they'd buy and sell through him. Horace's stock was, by all accounts, eclectic and ever-changing. He'd trade when he could, and despite being a day's ferry from the nearest towns, his prices were always fair. He paid good coin for good wares. That earned him a reputation amongst all those who traveled along the river. Of course, few realized his family ran the only inn. Much of what Horace gave away, his parents received back within the hour. Sometimes, if he felt a traveler was prone to drink, he'd pay generously for their goods. He let his customers feel high in their luck, as if they put one over on him. Sure as nightfall, they'd spend their newfound fortune, and often a little extra, on food, ale, and more ale, back at the inn. There wasn't much profit to the practice, but a little. It gave Horace some entertainment.